Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our December PHRC Lunch and Learn titled From Dialogue to Action, Community Engagement and Racial Justice as Catalysts for Education Equity, featuring our special guest, Diallo Brooks. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to our Executive Director, Chad Dion Lassiter, for some welcoming remarks.
Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone. First and foremost, just humbled to have our speaker here, Diallo Brooks, with us this afternoon. Also, extremely professionally appreciative of ASL. We could not be in this space without you, recognizing that it's not just a gift, but it's an art form and it's a discipline. So happy to have you all here in this space. Want to thank all the PHRC staff that have availed themselves to be here. I understand that we're competing with the end of the year celebration in our Harrisburg and Central office, and rightfully so. The whole entire commission has just been working beyond any expectation that any of us could have for any of you at this pivotal time. I'm excited to have Diallo Brooks here. Both he and I, along with our colleagues, have worked in this space with the United States Department of Education, and specifically with the Presidential Advisory Commission on Advancing Educational Equity, Excellence, Economic Opportunity for Black Americans. And I'll end by saying this: for us, it wasn't an appointment per se. It wasn't photo ops. It wasn't visits to the Oval Office with the President of the United States and others. It really, truly was a commitment in this space and a pedagogy towards justice for students of color. And I don't run from this, specifically for African-American students. The work that we have done, no matter who the administration shift will be, will live in perpetuity. And we have committed ourselves to working in this space for a period of time. I look up to this gentleman. I've learned from this gentleman in less than a year, and I look forward to extending brotherhood to him through the PHRC and on a personal level. So without further ado, back to our amazing, brilliant Director of Civil Rights, Director Meck. And Director Meck, as always, for you and Director Brofman, thank you for having me in this space. Looking forward to learning and taking copious notes. Thank you.
Thank you, ED. All right, so a little background on Diallo Brooks. He is the Senior Equity Fellow at the Schott Foundation, where he bridges the gap between national policymakers and grassroots education justice organizations to advance progressive policies for racial justice. Currently, his fellowship has him embedded at the U.S. Department of Education, where he continues to champion equity-focused policies within the education landscape. With over 25 years of experience in social justice and civil rights, Diallo has been a pivotal figure in promoting policies that foster safe, healthy, and thriving communities. Before assuming his current role, Diallo served as the Senior Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation, where he led grant-making and programmatic initiatives to promote equity and justice in education. Previously, he was the Senior Director of Field Mobilization at People for the American Way, where he was a national spokesperson on civil rights, voting rights, and civic engagement. He led the Defend the Black Vote initiative, successfully engaging millions of Black voters in the 2020 elections. Diallo is a board member of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and a former board member of the Network for Public Education Action. He has facilitated numerous trainings for nonprofits, elected officials, and other institutions to promote progressive values through leadership and policy enhancement. A former college basketball standout, Diallo holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Shepherd University. And without further ado, I turn it over to you, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to first off just really thank the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission for inviting me to participate in this Lunch and Learn. I'm very humbled and appreciative of this opportunity. And in particular, Chad, I just want to say thank you to you for your friendship and fellowship through this journey since we've been interacting with each other through the White House Black Initiative work. You know, I feel like we are kindred spirits in trying to create healthy, thriving, safe communities for everyone. And so this is really kind of the premise of this particular conversation. And like I said, I'm very humbled to be here in this space to have this conversation. First off, let me just kind of ground us in what I'm trying to get at with this conversation, and what we want to accomplish from this conversation. I always approach any of these conversations, particularly about communities, particularly about education, justice, particularly about marginalized communities, from an asset framework. Because oftentimes we have conversations that take us into a deficit and make us feel like a lot of the problems that exist are unsolvable, that folks are so far gone that we can't do anything to solve the problem that's in front of us. It becomes extremely daunting. It becomes extremely, in a way, it's a kind of an oppressive way of thinking about solving problems. So I like to kind of look at our community as assets. Like, everyone can achieve. All of our young people have abilities that, if we pour into them, we will see magnificent results. And so that's the way I approach education, education justice, and just civil rights and human rights work going forward. It's really about our investment. It's really about how we pour into people, how we really pull back the cloak and make sure that we are giving folks the tools that they need to be successful. The second piece that I think is critically important, and I mentioned this at the top, is that a lot of this work is really about not just about education as this isolated entity or a place that folks go to receive reading and writing and science skills, but education as a tool to create healthy, thriving, safe, productive communities. And that's why in this conversation, you cannot divorce community from education. Education is not just a building. It is the people, it is the community. And we're not educating folks just for the purpose of receiving a degree. We're educating folks to be able to function not only around the skills that they need around work, but also the skills that they need to interact in a healthy way with the folks in their community and folks even beyond their communities as well. And so that's why I take this particular perspective as it relates to this work. Now, when we look at equity and education equity, you cannot get to education equity if there's not justice. Justice is the underlying pillar to get toward equity. If we don't address the injustices that exist, then we cannot get to the place where folks have what they need to be successful in an educational environment. And equity doesn't mean everything is equal. There's a difference. There's a reason we use the word equity versus the word equal. Equal means we give everybody the same thing and expect folks to just move forward. In certain circumstances, some folks have been left behind in conversations. They have not had the tools. They have not had the resources. Their communities don't have the same economic advantages that other communities have. And so when we talk about justice, justice is closing that gap. Justice is making sure that every child that matriculates through our educational environment have the tools that they need specific to them to be successful, to be able to be not only just competitive, but to be a whole child, a whole person, a contributing member of our society. And that's kind of how I try to break it down, because we can always kind of pivot into our lanes and get into, our political kind of affiliations and miss the humanity behind the conversations that we have to have in order to heal folks, to make sure that folks are whole and have all of the tools that they need to be successful. And so, as we know, education is a critical pillar toward helping folks to have a thriving, functioning community, a thriving, functioning environment. It is one of the tools that is a great equalizer. It is a tool that allows us to break down and learn how to interact with each other in a way that creates the kind of environment we want to see within our communities and more broadly for our society as a whole. Just want to give you a couple of quotes that that really hit me as far as the power of education. One that comes to mind for me, Nelson Mandela had the quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." Now think about that, and not think of it in a punitive way, but a powerful weapon that when folks' minds are open, when they're given the tool of knowledge, how our world can be such a better place by actually having that access. And so as we look at education, education has to be that pillar, that kindling tool that allows us to move forward. Now, if you look at a lot of communities around this country, we also know that some communities have more access than others to the tools that they need to be successful. And when we talk about education justice, and particularly in the work that I've done, and it was mentioned that I work for the Schott Foundation for Public Education, what we believe is that the communities that are the most marginalized have the tools at hand to be the solution. So those folks that are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. And so in order to create the change we want to see, we have to make sure that those communities are centered in the conversations around the change that has to happen in our educational environments for their success. Now, let me say that again. The folks that are closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. That means that we cannot do two communities. We must have communities as a part of the conversation to create the change that we want to see. That means that we have to invest in those communities. We have to elevate the voices of the communities. We have to also listen to communities. What do you want? What are your needs? How do you get at those wants and needs? Oftentimes in education, it's easier to focus in on the pedagogy of learning, right? The pedagogy of schools, and also functioning within the school building. Not everyone has had an amazing experience with school, right? Some folks have had trauma as it relates to them going to school. And so when we talk about parent engagement, for example, sometimes I hear in a lot of spaces where folks are saying, well, parents are not showing up, they're not taking care of their kids, some of those parents have gone through the same school systems where they've had traumas, and the school building is not a place where they feel comfortable. They feel like they don't have the knowledge, they feel like they're not treated in a way that they're respected, and so it's not a place that they feel comfortable connecting to. And then that's not even to mention the other circumstances that may exist that may prevent parents from having that free time just to engage with the educational environment. And so what we have to do is have to move to a kind of a community school model where we are allowing and working with parents to engage in the school in a way that feels healthy for those parents as a part of the community, providing the supports those parents need to engage. Because I feel like, and I'm a parent, I have 3 children that have matriculated through public school. I'm in Washington, D.C. All of my children have matriculated through public school. And I know even, if with my work life and my, lifestyle and having my kids have 2 parents in the household, it still was hard to engage all the time with schools. But the best instances was when those schools were actually reaching out, connecting, having phone calls and conversations, not necessarily waiting for me to come in, but being proactive in that conversation in those spaces. That breaks down barriers that, I may have had and others may have as well around engaging in the school setting. And when those barriers are broken down, you can create partnerships that allow for an education environment that is healthy for those students. The more that parents are engaged, the more that schools engage those parental communities, or whether that be parents or caretakers or whoever is the adult that is working with that child, the more of those folks that are engaged, the better the outcomes for those students are. It is important to have a cultural competency when engaging to make sure that we're providing the kinds of spaces that folks feel safe to come into, to engage, and to understand what's happening in the education environment. It really is about the whole child. So let me tell you a little bit more about the work that I've done at the Schott Foundation. It was mentioned that I work for the Schott Foundation. I've been on loan for the past year at the U.S. Department of Education as a senior equity fellow, working to help the Department of Education implement its equity action plan, and then also bring an equity and community lens to the department from firsthand knowledge. A lot of the work that we do at the Schott Foundation is engaging with grassroots organizations that are working on education, equity, and justice on the ground in communities. Now, many of the organizations that we fund and support are grassroots organizations. They are parent or student-led organizations or community-based organizations that are really working on racial justice and education justice in their communities. And what we know is when we invest in resourcing those organizations and elevating the voices of community that are able to organize around equity and funding, that are organizing around school discipline issues, or even organizing around curriculum issues, making sure that there is culturally competent curriculum, that those communities are stronger, and the children that are impacted in those school systems are stronger as well. And so we believe that more emphasis has to be put on investing in those types of entities because the organizing allows folks to be civically active. This is part of their civic engagement. So as parents are engaged in what's happening in their schools, what's happening with the curriculum, they're able to be advocates. Sometimes the school has an idea of what they want to do, but they don't have the resources, right? And so if you have an organized community, organized parents, they're able to push against other structures that are moving those dollars. If they're civically active in speaking to their school boards, speaking to their state legislatures, speaking to their city councils, they're able to move more resources to those schools. And we've seen it happen in Pennsylvania. There was an equity fight for many years in Pennsylvania where folks were able to organize. They were able to connect with legal entities to make sure that resources were equitably distributed to the schools and students that need it the most, right? And so it took a campaign of organizing. We've seen it in New York. There was an equity fight in New York as well, in the state of New York, to make sure that those dollars are moved in a way that are equitably distributed to students and communities to impact the outcome of those young people. And there's many times there's barriers that are unintentional barriers that are created. But that's why we have to have a racial justice and an equity lens as we're looking at the education environment. What are the structural barriers that are preventing our young people from having all of the tools that they need to be successful? What are the structural barriers that are in the way that are not allowing young people to thrive? I'll tell you a story. Many years ago, working for another organization, I went with a minister in Chicago. My organization was connecting with the minister in Chicago that was trying to make an example from Chicago public schools to some of the suburban public schools that was in the state. And it was really around the equity of funding for the schools, because their school funding was tied to real estate taxes. So obviously, if you have higher real estate prices, you're able to have a higher tax base. And if you're in an inner city with a lower tax base, then you're getting less money, right? Less resources. So what he did, which was very interesting experiment, was take buses of students from Chicago public schools, took them out to see if they could register at some of the suburban public schools, right? Now we go from dilapidated schools that didn't have all of the tools and the basic needs of a school system, to a place that had sprawling campuses with tennis courts and out in buildings in different places. And what was refreshing is that those parents at the suburban school were holding up signs saying all children should have schools like this, right? And it really just was an experiment in the disparities between what some children have access to and what other children have access to. And in those disparities, you cannot have equity because there's not a just system of making sure that all children have the tools that they need to be successful. Now, what we would say is we would need to pour into those schools. It's not to bring the schools that are doing great, to have the beautiful campuses, that have all the AP and AB courses that students need to take to be college and career ready. It's not to take those things away, but it's to make sure that the children that are in other schools have those tools. They have access to that. They also have the supports to bridge the gaps from the many years of neglect that those young people have had throughout their careers, right? This is what we're talking about justice. Justice is about breaking down those barriers. Justice is about getting in there and making sure that the school discipline policies are not so punitive that they're pulling kids out. Because I think of a Black boy that's 10 years old as a 18-year-old Black boy, because I just look at Black males differently, right? And so when you start to have a cultural competency around what that education environment should look like, you start to implement practices that help to break down the barriers. And I like to lean into being proactive around those policies, around the things that are necessary to break down those barriers. It's not necessarily to just look at the past and say, hey, there was a problem, but it's like, here's some of the identified solutions. Now, whether you were intentional or unintentional about how you frame this environment, we can intentionally do some things going forward to help to mitigate those environments, to making sure that that young people have the tools. And one of the things that we've learned in the education landscape is that oftentimes those that have been neglected the most need additional resources. So like I said before, it's not about equal. Some students already have the tools that they need and they're functioning fine. But some students need a bit more above that baseline in order to be successful, because they've had gaps throughout their educational careers. Also, they may have gaps in their community environments that also impact what happens within the school building. Now, one of the things that we've done at the Schott Foundation, we have kind of a loving cities, loving frame of way of looking at the education environment. We know that housing is an education issue. We know that healthcare is an education issue. We know that transportation is an education issue. We know all of these other issues that folks lean into and do work around are education issues. If you don't have access to transportation to get to school, then you're going to have difficulties in school. If food insecurity is an issue in your community and you're not well fed coming into school, you're going to have difficulties in school. If you're having housing issue and you're the top of your mind as a student is that, where am I going to sleep tonight? Or my housing situation is unsafe, it's going to be hard to concentrate on the things that you need to concentrate on in school. And we often pick out anecdotal evidence of this one student that's overcome all of these obstacles and has become successful. But if we know and we look at the statistical data, we know that children that come from those environments have a much more difficult time. And that's why the advocacy and the organizing around community is so important, because we have to bridge all of those issues. We can't have education sit as a silo unto itself and act as if it will solve everything if the education system is not connected to the community in which it is there to serve. And I say serve because the educational environment is a place of service. It's this place of serving young people, supporting young people, helping young people to grow, not just learning about, and I like to use a sports analogy, we always say the X's and O's on the field, but not just about the classroom X's and O's, right? We're also talking about how we interact with each other. One of the greatest things about learning, and I realize this even more in college. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm not going to give my age, but like, and during a time where, it was a overwhelmingly predominantly African-American community. I went to a PWI, and what I've learned is the interaction with different folks, different people, different backgrounds, coming from different places was a part of my educational attainment. It was also a part of the educational attainment for the other folks that were interacting with me as well, right? Because we were able to share perspectives. And so the more we're able to pour into and create rich environments for our young people, that personal interaction, learning even from folks from the same place, have different backgrounds, right? Learning how to function and interact with each other is a critical life skill that we all know in our professional environments. We come from all over the place into our professional environment, have various backgrounds. But in order for our professional environment to be successful, we all have to pull in the same direction, right? And we have to bring the perspectives and the knowledge and the history of who we are into those spaces in ways that help enhance the environments we're in. It's the same thing with education. Our young people have to learn critical thinking skills, not just rote memory, not just following the pattern, but really stepping outside the box, learning how to be creative, how to think beyond what's just right in front of you, how to interact socially with the folks around you in order to accomplish projects. I was talking to my daughter, who is a senior at Howard University here in Washington, D.C., and she was talking about a group project that she had, and it's like, yeah, and this person wants to do it this way, and this. I said, the reason why they give you a group project is because the professor is trying to help you to learn to work with others to accomplish a goal, right? When we go into our professional environments, we're not siloed. We're not a tennis player playing by ourselves. We're on a team, and in a team environment, folks have to know their roles, know how to interact with each other, and know how to pull out the best in each of you to accomplish great things, right? And that's what our education environment is. We have an opportunity to really create what we want to see for our young people. We have to model that in our education environments in a way that we break down the barriers that exist that keep schools siloed from the community. At the Department of Education, one of my colleagues helped to organize a great event around community engagement or parental engagement. And what a lot of the experts were saying that were in the room, they came over to the US Department of Education to have a conversation around the science around parental engagement. And I'm not going to bore you with the data around it, but the more that schools are engaging parents intentionally and bridging those gaps, the better those students actually do in the school environment. And the need for schools not only to just say they're doing parental engagement, but to actually be proactive around that, to actually have staffing that their job to kind of monitor and work with teachers and the professionals within the school space to engage community. So it's not just a phone call. Sometimes there needs to be a conference. Sometimes there needs to be home visits. Sometimes there needs to be other types of meetings to break down those barriers. But the schools that were intentional about that put the resources there, that helped to train the teachers to work and support teachers, because we don't want to ask teachers to do things that they're not equipped to do, but we want to make sure that they have the tools to do what's necessary to maximize the outcome of the young people that they get to interact with every single day. And then the community engagement piece is also making sure that there's resourced organizations on the ground whose job is to monitor that, to make sure that that is happening in the school environment, to hold accountable elected officials and school leaders to make sure that that is happening. And also to provide critical feedback as well. Critical feedback is important. One of the things I've learned a while ago was that all conflict is not bad, right? It is not negative. When you create a healthy conflict environment where you're allowed to push, and pull, we learn together. As long as it's a healthy environment and it's a respectful environment, we can move forward. So if you create an environment which says, well, you've implemented this idea, this is how this idea is landing with us in our community. So the intent might not match what is happening on the ground, right? And so you need some pushback to say, to inform folks that, hey, what you intended to do is not having the impact that you expected to have. And that's a healthy conflict. You need that conflict. It's like, they say iron sharpens iron. Well, iron can't sharpen iron if it's not hitting each other, right? If it's not pushing and sliding against each other to really help sharpen the thinking and sharpen the way in which we do the work. And so that's the role of these community organizations. It's not just to be punitive to the school system or to elected officials, or just get on folks' nerves every day. It really is to help create an environment that is the healthiest, most thriving environment that we can create for our young people. And in order, no matter what our political differences are, it is incumbent upon us as a people to really work together to eliminate the injustices that exist, to create environments that are healthy, that folks feel like they can be engaged in, to create the change we want to see within our school systems. We cannot sit back and allow our education system to just be this disparate piece that's sitting alone by itself, that we just feed folks into and just hope that great things will come out in the future. When we lean into education, when we lean into young people, when we give young people hope, we provide the resources and tools to young people, they will thrive. And all of the advances that we see in our society and throughout history have come from young people pushing the envelope, right? Young people being creative, young people being supported and then given the tools that they need in order to let that new idea spark and be set free into the world in which we can create a better place for all of us. But like I said, for us around the work, it is really about the bridge between community and schools. And when you create that environment, that's when you start to move toward equity. You move toward equity when you rid your schools, rid the community from the injustices that stand in the way of healthy healthy young people. And those injustices are the roadblocks, right? Those injustices are the things that stand in the way. When you start to expel students, when you pipeline students out of school into prison, right? That's not healthy for our society. It's about the early interventions of young people, understanding what that young person may need, what obstacles that young person has in their lives that is causing them maybe to act out in certain ways, and in rectifying the real problem instead of throwing, a tarp over it and pretending that it's not there, right? It's about also understanding how we interpret young people, right? How we interpret different groups of young people, whether they're Black, brown, indigenous, white, rural, poor, that come from impoverished environments, how we perceive these young people. Our perception also plays a role in adding injustice. And if we can change how we perceive young people and look at every young person as a person that's capable, a person that is able to thrive, then we can also then break down the barriers and provide that young person with the tools that they need to be successful. That's what I mean by justice. Justice doesn't happen, so you can't, so the through line, the long story short is the through line to equity is justice. The tool is community, right? You have to have healthy, strong communities to build around the justice to lead toward equity. Because we talk a lot about, because equity is an easy conversation, and I've worked in the philanthropic space, and a lot of the folks like to talk about equity and say equity is the end goal. Like we want equity, but we don't ever talk about the justice piece of it, right? We don't talk about the racial justice. Sometimes you have to call out the elephant in the room in order to get toward the change we want to see. And if you're not really focusing on what the real obstacle is, you can't get to the end game that you want to see. And so equity exists if we have just communities, just school systems, then we can then move toward equity. We can make sure that folks have the tools that they need. Now, when I talk about this stuff, a lot of times folks have a tendency to like, yeah, how do we do this work? What are the things we need to implement? How do we create the through way to get to where we want to see, where we want to go? I think that there's a tremendous amount of data that already exists. We kind of already know where some of the problems are that exist, right? We also know the inequities in some of the funding that we've seen. So the way the rubber hits the road is that when we allow ourselves to do the work that's needed to create the change we want to see, we micro focus on the places that we need to invest, move resources to, and support the resourcing of those communities to be successful. We allow schools to be much more of an open space as it relates to community, a place where community can feel like that they're engaged in a way to support the development of our young people. It is about allowing community organizations and investing in community organizations in a way that break down the barrier around organizing. Organizing, like there's a lot of people that call themselves activists. Activists like to get on TV and speak, but organizers are the ones on the ground that are in the households, they're talking to their neighbors, they're at the grocery store, they're at the corner store, they're at the barber shop, they're at the beauty salon, they're at the community event. Organizers are the ones that are bringing people together. Sometimes we get allergic to the word organizing. Sometimes we get afraid of organizing as this bad, oh, here they come, they're organized. But organizing is really bringing people together around common interests to push for the things that those folks want to see. And we all have to be open to listening to community. I've over the years started to try to move away from the word empowerment, because what it has this connotation of that I have power, I'm giving my power to somebody else, and now they have power too, right? But what I like to think of communities as places that already have power. Communities already have power. What I like to do from an organizer perspective is help communities unlock that power. Help them to, one, see and realize that they do have this power, and help them have the tools that they need to unlock that power to create the change that they want to see for their communities. Because ultimately, I can have any idea I want, but if I'm not from that community, I'm not of that community, all I am is dictating my own thoughts and processes onto a community, and not really listening and not really caring about what it is they know that they need. Goes back to what I said earlier. Those that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Those that understand what they've been going through every day, they have solutions right there that just need to be unlocked. And they need to be organized in a way that they're able to utilize their power to move forward. Now, one of the things that we do in organizing spaces in order to help that to happen is I tell folks all the time is that you have to also take small victories, right? Because also a lot of times we can try to tackle problems that are so big they become daunting, and when you don't accomplish everything that you wanted to accomplish, you feel defeated, and folks tend to walk away. I tell folks sometimes that organizing community is sometimes getting 5 people together just to have a conversation. That's a win to me when that community wasn't having that conversation to begin with. Another win could be, hey, the next meeting, we have 25, 30 people there. Somebody was able to help provide food for folks to be able to come and sit and fellowship and talk. That's another victory. of folks coming together. The next victory could be along the continuum is that that group of folks that has come together develops an action plan, a plan of what they want to see done as they move forward. And you celebrate those victories along the way. Even the small micro victories you have to celebrate, because in order to organize, you have to have folks feel a sense of hope. And hope is sometimes couched in small wins, right? Because those things didn't happen before. So you have to uplift them and celebrate them and make a big deal about them, right? Like, okay, we came up with the action plan. We didn't even have action plan. We didn't even have 20 people in the room last week. Now we got 25 in the room, right? That's a great thing. We've come a long way. So here's our agenda. And then the next piece is maybe we hold a meeting with the school board, right? Or just one elected official, right? We've done that. These are the pieces of work that can be done along the way to help community feel like a sense of accomplishment around the things that they're trying to accomplish. And then you help folks to realize that too, that organized people beats organized money. Organized people beats organized money. So if you have, all these, big money pieces that are kind of pushing against you, the more folks you're able to bring together is positive. And then I've worked with elected officials for many years, and one of the things that I know move elected officials are people, right? Constituents. And so when your constituents show up, those elected officials have to pay attention, because the more organized they are, the more that they're going to realize that constituency is going to be civically active, right? We oftentimes, and I like to put this in the context of even voting, the organizing, the justice and racial justice work as far as civic engagement, because a lot of times folks lean into voting as the only piece of civic engagement. Like, folks want to vote, they go home, and they do it again in 4 years, right? Or whatever the timeline for that election is. But civic engagement is just even having the conversations about your concerns in an organized way with those elected leaders that you put into places of power to make decisions about lives every single day. And the more that community is able to be a part of those conversations, to have those conversations, to see elected officials as folks that work for them versus the other way around, the more power that community is going to have in creating the change that they want to see. And like I said, it doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. It is really an informative relationship, right? As an elected official, I should want to know what my community thinks about particular issues. I should want to know and hear from my community about what's working and what's not working for them in their particular communities. And I should be a bridge to help break down those barriers that stand in the way of my community from being thriving, healthy, safe environments, right? Because that's what everybody wants. I don't care what you look like, where you're from, what your racial or ethnic background is. We all want healthy, thriving communities to live in, right? We want to have places where our young people can play, we can feel safe outside. We feel like we have the tools necessary to put food on our table. All the resources, we have shelter, not just shelter, but really adequate shelter to really take care of ourselves and our families. That's what communities want. And so as elected officials, when our communities are able to articulate what their needs are, where the gaps are, and be in partnership to solve those problems, we create healthy environments. And the educational environment is a pillar of that, right? It is a pillar of having that healthy, thriving community, because our young people need the tools to be able to be gainfully employed at some day, whether that be self-employed or employed working for a company or an organization. Our young people need the tools to be able to grow, to be able to bring new ideas into spaces that help to make our communities and our society thrive. And so this is part of the continuum. This is part of the organizing. This is part of the justice and racial justice. And I think that as we look at racial justice, oftentimes it can be a bad word in some environments. The DEI piece is being under attack, but really our diversity, our equity, having an inclusive environment is how we create safe and healthy spaces for us to grow as people. It helps us to be in a stronger position. It is not a negative, it is a positive. It is something that helps us to move forward. The more I learn from folks that are not like me, the stronger I am, the better off I am, because I'm able to look at different perspectives, look different ideas. But when I am excluded from that conversation, I'm very limited in what I can see and do and the worldview that I may have. And so it's critically important that we work through a racial justice lens from communities that have often been left behind to make sure that they have the resources they need to impact an educational, community educational environment that allow our young people to thrive, to matriculate into this world and be assets that they are. Our young people are assets. The last thing I'll leave you with is young people are assets. They help us to be better. They are our future. I know that's cliche, but our future is brighter when we're leaning into our young people, when we're providing the types of spaces that our young people need to be successful moving forward. And so let's be a catalyst for that change. Let's be a catalyst for engagement. Let's not be afraid of the friction that's sometimes needed in order to push the envelope. And let's do the work that we need to create loving environments. Loving environments are not the test scores, right? When you talk to your spouse or your friend or your partner or your friends, you're not doing a test score to judge how much they love you, right? It's a more organic piece than that. And the more we're able to lean into that, the better off we are as a community. And so with that, I'll stop there because I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A and any other thoughts that folks might have.
Wow, it's inspiring. I just wanted to share one thing, and then definitely hold space for others. That aspect of loving environments is essential. At the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, yes, we are a enforcement agency. We want people to file complaints, whether they're forms of unlawful discrimination or real, perceived, or imagined, whatever it is. Trust us, who've been trained as investigators in an unbiased manner to investigate the complaints. But it really is about loving environments. It's really about, we've launched this initiative called the Beloved Community, as I shared with you, Chase, and our colleagues at the White House, the work of Martin Luther King Jr., Rabbi Abraham Yahshua Heschel, but also there's equity in it. It builds off of the work of Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, multiple white allies and accomplices. And I think that's what's missing on a lot of levels, is that love. When I grew up in South Central Los Angeles and North Philadelphia, our teachers were in our community. Our teachers lived in our community and they saw us as a both and. It was like, Chad Lassiter, I need you to turn that book report in on time, but it also was that love. Boy, when you walk across that street, you better look both ways. When you walk across that street, you better go ahead and make sure that you cross on the green light. Because if you jaywalk, you got a ticket for jaywalking.
Right.
So that loving environment and looking at people, and in particular our students in our communities from a strengths-based perspective, is just heartfelt by me. So I just wanted to share that. And definitely back to you, Director Meck, so we can open it up for any Q&A, responses or comments that others have. But the love ethic is powerful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Brooks. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Took plenty of notes because as a mother as well, let me make sure in my community, what are some things that we can tackle with truth, love, and kindness, as Edie mentioned. I did want to say for everyone here, if you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand or place it in the chat. We'll give that just a minute. And in the meantime, I did want to highlight 2 quotes that spoke to me during your presentation, and it definitely was, iron can't sharpen iron if it's not hitting each other. And that's, another way to reframe healthy conflict And that meant a lot to me. And my second quote I put, or your quote that I put in the chat was, "Organized people beats organized money." And I think that's a powerful context to, to look into in its entirety, because I think we can often feel defeated against the backdrop of politicians or people in positions of power with so much money, and yet really it's the powers in the community, the powers in uplifting those voices and having that support system. So thank you so much for highlighting that. I do see someone with their hand up. Myrna, if I'm saying your name correctly. And then you're on mute, so if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to go ahead and ask your question or say your comment.
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a concern, and my question is for Mr. Chad. My name is Myrna. January 4th of 2024, I filed a discrimination complaint on behalf of my son with the PHRC, and around July, the investigative report came in. And August the 19th, we find ourselves in a position where we had to file a appeal, because the investigator of the case, to keep the integrity of the agency, I'm not going to mention the name. However, she was biased to a fault. We have compelling evidence that the investigator of the case was very dishonest on the investigative finding. I emailed your entire executive staff. I also emailed yourself to bring it to your attention, but it's like I'm hitting a brick wall. I am trying to find out, who can I talk to? Can I personally email you? Because I really don't want to bring everything that went on with the investigation to the forefront right now. It's
Yes.
really sad that, an agency that is supposed to protect my son, that is protected by the Civil Act right of 1964. And it was such a disappointed. We have very overwhelming evidence that point directly that she was extremely biased.
Okay. Let me first and foremost say thank you. And I'm not trying to placate you for speaking up, speaking out, and also critiquing the PHRC. What I would like to do is to have you uh, give us your phone number, and our deputy chief counsel. Let me finish, please. Our deputy chief counsel can follow up with you right in this moment, because what we want to do is we want to hold space for some questions, some comments, and feedback for this presentation for Mr. Brooks. But I want you to hear me so very clearly. Thank you for speaking up, stepping up, and critiquing the PHRC. I don't investigate cases, and I would imagine that I get hundreds. I know I get hundreds and hundreds of emails daily. Nevertheless, you are a person that we would be concerned about with regards to all this. But without knowing anything about your case, please reach out right now with your phone number, and Deputy Chief Counsel Morgan Williams will follow up with you in the next 5 minutes. I think that's more advantageous. And thank you for not breaching confidentiality with the investigators' information. But once again, PHRC, we're not perfect. We're not above any critique with forthcoming recommendations. And this is what Diallo Brooks was talking about with regards to love, and what we're talking about with regards to the beloved community. And I'm glad that you're in this space because there was something that was given in this presentation that, puts you in a space to want to reach out. PHRC, we're not gonna answer any questions in this space. We're going to keep it germane to the presentation, but we definitely want her to give her phone number, and Director Chang, our Director of Education, and our Deputy Chief Counsel will follow up with you.
Sounds good. And I will say I'll turn it over to Director Chang at this time for comment on the presentation that we just had.
Okay, as long as it's the presentation, I think with her, it probably is.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. I don't want to ingratiate, placate, or display false generosity. Thank you so much. And DCC Williams will be following up with you. Let's make sure we get her number, Director Mac. Director Chang.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And once again,
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are, Director Chang. Oh, now you're back to muted.
Okay, sorry, my computer was getting choppy. I just wanted to say thank you.
Director Chang, you went out.
To rally at the local level and the community level and not be dissuaded by what we're seeing in other arenas and kind of larger scale changes and challenges that we're seeing. But I do want to ask, just being as though you've been in this space for many years, and I'm sure been through the ebbs and flows that we're seeing now in the education space, I know there's a lot of concern. Just in Pennsylvania alone, we're seeing
Director Chang, we lost you.
Oh.
Well, let me say this, because I know kind of what I've been getting at. So there's a couple of things to think about. One thing is just to always remember that most education funding, most education work happens on the state and local level. The federal government plays a role, but it's insignificant. It's significant, but it's not as significant as the resources that come from the state and local level. Also, for most people, you're much closer to your state and local environments. So engaging there is the place I would say go to, because they make the decisions for the most part about what that education landscape will look like. The federal government, I try to look at the federal government as much more of a granting entity that provides resources. There's also some civil rights see, I'm messing up my words. They have the ability to investigate cases, civil rights cases that may come up as well on the federal government. And I would say that if folks have larger civil rights issues, to continue to reach out to the U.S. Department of Education, because as this current administration will be going through January 20th, and so folks should feel like they should have agency to engage up until that point. I'm not sure what it'll look like after that, but I know that there are folks who are doing that work. But long story short, the local level is the place to really, really engage, and also where you can see the most dramatic outcomes as it relates to the education environment, education landscape.
One thing that comes to mind, our Director of Civil Rights Division, Cheryl, and Desiree, our Director of Education, we met to get ahead of, these deeply funded think tanks that are saying that if you position it as DEI is bad, if you go justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, JEDI is bad, if you go DEIB, it's bad. Words matter. Also, your work, the work of Sean Harper and others, if you go belonging to humanity, I just want to get your opinion on this, even though we're in a moment. If you go belonging to humanity, if you go equal opportunity, it seems as if they're so funded that they see right through that. I'm not saying that you're trying to do a covering, but what would you recommend? So for instance, PHRC, we do a lot of DEI trainings, and we do the DEI trainings for the Department of Corrections in the state, Department of Education, Department of Labor and Industry. What do you see as the trend? Some people are holding on to it like, no, it's DEI. And then others are seeing things being torn away, not just what's happening with Walmart, but in various other places. What would be your recommendation to an agency like us?
So I'm gonna give you my personal recommendation. I mean, for me, I always like to call things what they are, and lean into that. I know some environments are not necessarily conducive to that, and so you might have to be a little nuanced in how you approach that. But my thought process is always focus on the outcome. Like, what are you trying to achieve, right? And I think once you articulate what you're really trying to achieve, you're able to kind of navigate these environments that maybe looking for trigger words and things like that. Because and that's why I say, when I was talking about what we wanted to create is healthy, safe, thriving communities, right? And so what are the tools we need to get there? and then you start to articulate those tools. And like, this is how this breaks down that barrier. This is how this impacts our community. This is how it's good for the broader community. Because also folks have this deficit thinking where if I invest in one community, it means a lack of investment in another community. And so what you have to look at is like, when you start to rising tide lifts all boats, right? And so if you look at the least common denominator and you start to invest in those spaces, it is actually beneficial for all of us. So it's really about how we utilize language as it relates to what we're trying to actually achieve.
Wow, thank you.
See that Director Chang is trying to hop back on here.
I'm back, Director Mack.
Okay.
Apologies. IT's working behind the scenes on my computer.
No problem.
No, I was just saying I appreciated the reminder for the need to rally at the community level. I think the one thing that came to mind, and I don't even know that you have the answer for this, but you've been in this field for so long, Mr. Brooks, but you mentioned about those that are closest to the problem or closest to the solutions. And I think those of us that do this work, even here at our agency, we know this. But I think some of the biggest hurdles are getting those that are not centered around the problem to recognize how vast and significant and severe the problem is, and be willing to listen to the voices and the proposed suggestions of the victims of the disparities and racial injustices that we're seeing. I mean, the children just in the vulnerable populations alone for the school to prison pipeline, those parents, their voices are not being heard in the communities that they are the minority, the literal minority, not in the general sense that we use it. And so how do we uplift the voices when the voices are so few in certain communities?
Yeah, and that's where the organizing comes. I appreciate that point, and that's where the organizing really comes in, because one of the things that we do as we work with communities is you elevate the voices. You allow folks from the community to be able to articulate their own circumstances, but there's also a lot of training to make sure that information lands the way it needs to land. And I've done a lot of bipartisan work throughout the years. One of the things is like leaning in on values-based leadership, right? And some of that values-based work requires us to understand the value of the person that you're actually talking to. What are the things that person values? And sometimes those are the things that actually move the needle, because some of the things that may be important to us might not be important to somebody else, right? But once you articulate, and I'll give you a great example. I did some work around criminal justice years ago, and we had Democrat and Republican folks talking about the issues, but once you understood that some more conservative folks were more concerned about the budget than they were about whether folks were incarcerated. And when you start bringing those into the conversation, it's like, well, it is actually more fiscally responsible to go about doing the work this way than it is the way that we've been going, right? And this is how we save resources. And that's just one example. When we bring up those examples that actually resonate with the folks that we're trying to move, I think it's helpful. But then it's also about volume too. So as you start to bring into spaces the volume of voices, it becomes much more difficult to stand in opposition to that volume, because it becomes problematic when you have news media and you have coverage and folks are surrounded by this echo chamber of voices. And then you also look at the coalition of the willing, like folks that are actually there with you or that you can move, and have them also be conduits to creating that change.
Thank you.
If I may, so just the exchange between the two of you is so much appreciated, because Director Meck and I was talking about, for every Moms for Liberty, deeply funded, from a grassroots perspective and other perspectives, there could be Moms for Justice. And so that community organizing is always available. And history, as you know, Diallo, and a lot of us on this call, I see Gregory Holtz on this call, that history of organizing is ever before us. The organizing from the Black church, the organizing from synagogues, the organizing of masjids in Chicago, Father Flager and others, right? And so I think that's oftentimes what's lost is, to your point, we've tried to push people in understanding that we've had events at PHRC where 200 people have showed thumbs up. The same synergy, the same energy, the same intellectual property, the same passion should be there, and it is there if it's 5 people. One of the things about your presentation is that we had, I think, at the highest 42 people on here, but it's being recorded, and so it's in perpetuity. And so these conversations that we oftentimes have end with, well, we don't have the money that they have. The civil rights movement comes about with people who did not have millions of dollars, going against unjust systems like the Birmingham boycott of the Birmingham bus system and several others. And I think that history and the contemporary moment shows us what can happen. I have one last question, and I'm just here to learn with this question from the perspective of, at the height of George Floyd, the civil unrest, not just America, but the globe was captivated with the burdensome, troublesome COVID, as well as the civil unrest. And our DEI initiatives emerged. Everybody had a DEI initiative. Major League Baseball, Merrill Lynch, Michelob Light, Ben and Jerry's. A lot of people have argued in this moment that that was because that was the moment, and that there were no safeguards and there was not a vanguard overseeing to make sure that we got out of the decade with DEI initiatives and DEI officers. How do you sustain a movement? How do you sustain a movement in the midst of all of this? Like, we've seen Occupy Wall Street. I know this is a lot, but
Yeah.
We've seen Occupy Wall Street, gone. We've seen this, gone. What happened in this space with DEI from 2020 to now?
Well, there's a difference between, like I said, I mentioned before, there's a lot of activism, and organizing can be two different things, right? The activism is playing to the moment, speaking to the crowds. There's a lot of energy. There's a tipping point at that particular moment. But the organizing requires you, no matter what the moment is, no matter what that tipping point is, how the kind of ebb and flow of the environment is creating the systems and tools needed to sustain the work going forward. And so what we haven't done is okay, we're at a flashpoint of an emotional moment, but what is it that we're trying to accomplish? What are the systems that we need to have in place in order to have sustainability around that? And what happens is, and you see it with the election too, is like, you can't do flash pan organizing. You have to do longitudinal organizing. It has to be a sustainable effort of engaging people on an ongoing basis, but also elevating the local voices in the process. Because oftentimes we get the Messiah syndrome, where Diallo has to get up and be the person, the spokesperson. One of the things I like about the Poor People's Campaign that Reverend Barber and others are working on is that in their events, they elevate the people that are impacted, that are the folks that are impacted, to be the speakers, to be the ones that are actually articulating what's happening on the ground. And I'll say this too, as it relates to elected officials, that's the difference between like a Mounds of Liberty and true community organizing, because it's not an AstroTurf organizing process where they're flying folks in from someplace else to speak or to be, outraged by what's happening on the local level. But when you elevate the parent that is actually in that school, the folks actually in that community, it's a much more powerful. But you also have to leave folks with the tools that they need to have sustainability around this work. It can't be a flash in the pan. And the civil rights movement, I'll give you a good example. Civil rights movement wasn't popular at the time. It's like, as it gained momentum, people didn't want to be left out, so they got involved, right? If you poll Martin Luther King's popularity during that time, he had a very low popularity rating, right? And so, like, everybody's not going to be with you, but you have to do the sustained organizing. And then as the momentum builds, as those flash pan moments happen, you have an infrastructure that's ready to respond and ready to sustain that energy on an ongoing basis.
No, I appreciate that, because I had struggled during that 2020 moment You're taking down the larger Ulysses S. Grant statue, Robert E. Lee statue, and the city of Philadelphia. You're taking down the Frank Rizzo statue, but the systemic and structural and meta racism, is still there. The policies are still there. The killing unarmed individuals and the state getting off with impunity is still there. You still have that form of educational apartheid in the schools are still there. And that's why this important work that you do and all of us are doing is so important to hold on to that aspect of hope, even with the most recent kind of context we're in. Director Meck, I think we're good, but it's your program and we still have people here. So for the 30 people who are here, thank you so much for being here. And once again, our Director of Communication does a phenomenal job of just making sure that this is archived within our YouTube, share with people, share with districts. We're going to share with our PDE colleagues. Some of our White House colleagues are on here. I've been getting texts, with emojis like, yo, Diallo is fire, right? He's bringing it, right? Sorry to breach confidentiality in the public space, but just an honor to have you here. Director Meck.
Thank you. And if we can, there was just one more comment / question. And then, as Edie was mentioning, I appreciate everyone's time as we are at the almost 2:15-minute mark. So clearly people are interested and invested in this conversation. So with that, the last comment and question includes, thank you for a great presentation. What are your recommendations or best practices for smaller municipalities establishing their own HRCs who are looking to gain traction as an educational resource for the community?
Well, like I said before, thank you for the question. I think it's a great question. I think the first thing is that remember that people matter. And so is to really have a people-centered conversation and really glean from the community what their wants and needs are. And I always start with small and not try to do the grandiose thing to begin with. I really like who is the coalition of the willing, who are the folks that are willing to have the initial conversations to build structure. Then as you pour in more folks and more resources to that conversation, you kind of build that out. But it's a lot easier for folks, for the broader community to come in, to engage when there's actually some structural integrity there. There's like an idea of what the North Star is, what you're trying to accomplish and achieve, and how that fits into their daily lives. And then also be flexible based on time, availability of folks. People have work schedule, life schedule, children. That creates the space for folks to be able to really start to organize in a way that creates the entities that they need on the ground to push back.
Thank you so much for that answer, Mr. Brooks, and for your presentation and an hour well spent. With that said, everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day. Check out the link on our social media sites. Take care.
Thank you so much, everyone.